Hello, I'm Greg Prymak, Apostolic Assistant for Community of Christ, Southern USA Mission Field. In this section, we will consider the nature, interpretation, and application of Scripture. What is Scripture? Written Scripture includes a text, words written on paper, electronically, or in another format. These words in turn are read, interpreted, and understood in some way by the reader. But there is more to Scripture than a text. There is also a context, a larger setting, historical, cultural, social, political, economic, linguistic, etc., in which the text itself is composed. And there is more to Scripture than words. There is, as well, some underlying experience that has caused the writer to reflect, to understand, to choose certain words, and then to write, all in order to express ideas and thereby say something that is understandable to the reader in the context and language in which it is written. How is Scripture interpreted? The written words, to begin with, are read and understood according to what they mean within their particular language system: Hebrew, Greek, English, Spanish, French, etc. The larger setting and the writer's experience are also taken into account so that the ideas she or he is expressing are interpreted and understood according to their significance in the context and language in which they are written. We are going to explore the nature, interpretation, and application of Scripture by looking at three sets of slave regulations in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. Specifically, we will compare how Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, and Leviticus 25 answer two specific questions. First, can an Israelite own a fellow Israelite as a slave? Second, if so, what happens when an Israelite slave is released from slavery? Understanding what Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, and Leviticus 25 say, and why and how they say it, with regard to these two questions, will pose some further questions for us to think about with regard to the nature, interpretation, and application of Scripture. Some brief comments about the composition and dating of the Old Testament will be useful for this study. Before the Old Testament was written, a number of different traditions and sources, some oral, others in writing, had developed and were in circulation. The authors used material from these traditions and sources when they wrote the various books of the Old Testament. The Old Testament in many places thus includes earlier material that originated and circulated in ancient Israel before the Old Testament, as we now have it, was written. Dating some Old Testament writings with precision is difficult. Often the best that can be done is to identify the general time frame within which a given book or its source material appears to have been composed. We will analyze the slave laws in Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, and Leviticus 25 as source material, i.e., from the standpoint of what they were saying when they were originally written and before they were incorporated into the final, complete books of Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus. Their dating will be important in terms of their sequence and relative times of composition, rather than the exact dates they were written. This approach will help us understand and compare how the ancient Israelites grappled with the same issues, the ownership and release of Israelite slaves, at three different intervals across several hundred years of time. Around the end of the 13th century BC, perhaps between 1250 and 1220, some slaves escaped from Egypt. Pharaoh's army gave chase and trapped them against the sea. During the night, a strong wind arose and pushed back the water. The slaves passed over to the other shore. When the Egyptians pursued, the sea returned and drowned them. The escaped slaves eventually crossed the Sinai Peninsula, entered Canaan, and established themselves in what is present-day Israel. These former slaves believed that what happened to them was the mighty act of God, that God delivered them from bondage in Egypt and gave them not only freedom, but also a home, the land of Israel. They therefore made a covenant with God and built a community. Not just a human society, but a godly one. A society that would be a fitting response to God, who had delivered them out of slavery and into freedom. A society that would model the very nature and saving action of God in all of its aspects: religion, politics, economy, personal relationships, etc. Let's examine each of the three passages in more detail. Exodus 21, 1 through 11 is the earliest slave law. It probably dates from the period of the Judges, approximately the 12th to 10th century BC. At that time, the Israelites had become settled in Israel, and the economy was based on agriculture and barter. Exodus 21, 1 through 11 reflects an actual situation in Israel around 1200 to 1000 BC. Israelite slavery is being practiced. Israelites own fellow Israelites as slaves. Verses 2 to 6 indicate that some Israelites are selling, buying, and owning male Israelites as slaves. According to verses 7 to 11, some Israelite fathers are selling their daughters as slaves to Israelite men. These Israelite slave owners are probably well-to-do landholders. The Israelite slaves, poor people, who need money or are unable to pay their debts. Exodus 21 allows Israelites to own other Israelites, both men and women, as slaves. Verses 2 to 6, however, require an Israelite slave owner to release a male Israelite slave from his slavery and his debt after 6 years of service. This 6-year limitation is significant. For one thing, it makes an Israelite man's slavery temporary rather than permanent, more a lease than a purchase. For another, it reflects the idea of Exodus 13, 3 through 10, and many other passages in the Old Testament, that God has redeemed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, which means that God has purchased them back from their master Pharaoh, that God is their rightful owner, and that they are therefore slaves to God. As such, they belong to God and have no right to sell themselves to anyone else. An Israelite man, then, can only lease himself to another Israelite, i.e., serve his owner for 6 years, not for life. Verses 7 to 11 treat female Israelite slaves differently. Like verses 2 to 6, they permit an Israelite man to own an Israelite woman as a slave, but they do not require him to release her from her slavery or her debt after 6 years of service. Instead, she is expected to become his wife or concubine, and thus a permanent member of his household. If he does not marry her, he must either redeem her by selling her back to her family or perhaps to another Israelite man, or give her to his son for his wife or concubine. If the owner marries her but later takes another wife, he must continue to give her all of her marital rights, or else release her and her debt without any payment in return. Verses 2 to 6 and 7 to 11 share an important feature. When the slavery of an Israelite man or woman comes to an end, the Israelite slave owner is required to release their debt, but not to give or pay them anything more. An Israelite ex-slave, whether male or female, thus rejoins the community as a free man or woman, but in the same financial condition, poverty, that probably led to their slavery in the first place. Deuteronomy 15, 12 to 18 is the second slave law. It was probably part of an early edition of Deuteronomy that originated in northern Israel during the 8th century BC, a copy of which was later discovered in the temple at Jerusalem in 621 and led to or accelerated the religious, social, and political reforms of King Josiah. This period was a time of religious and social upheaval. Israelites were worshiping foreign gods. The kingdoms of Israel in the north and Judah in the south were independent and prosperous. The economy was no longer agricultural and barter, but monetary in nature. A significant and growing problem, though, was that some had acquired means and become well off, while others had become impoverished. Wealthier people were lending their money with interest to poorer people who were often unable to repay their loans, and as a consequence were forced to sell their ancestral lands and sometimes even themselves to their creditors. Israelite prophets like Amos, Hosea, and Isaiah condemned these practices and called instead for renewing and observing the ancient Mosaic covenant between God and Israel, and for strengthening traditional social structures that would safeguard the poor. Deuteronomy 15, 12 to 18 reflects a second actual situation in Israel during the 700s BC, or some 300 to 400 years later than the one addressed in Exodus 21. Slavery is still being practiced. Israelites continue to own fellow Israelites, both men and women, as slaves. Verses 12 to 14 and 17b to 18 indicate that some Israelite men and women are being sold to other Israelites as slaves. Similar to the situation in Exodus 21, these Israelite slave owners are probably wealthy landholders, the Israelite slaves poor and in need of money or unable to pay their debts. Deuteronomy 15 also permits Israelites to own other Israelites, both men and women, as slaves. Like Exodus 21, Verse 12 requires an Israelite slave owner to release a male Israelite slave from slavery and debt after 6 years of service. Unlike Exodus 21, however, verse 12 requires an Israelite slave owner to do likewise with a female Israelite slave. Deuteronomy 15 thus does away with the differentiation between men and women in Exodus 21 and treats Israelite slaves, men and women, similarly. Deuteronomy 15, moreover, modifies what must be done when the slavery of an Israelite man or woman comes to an end. Exodus 21 requires an Israelite slave owner to release the debt of his slave, but not to give or pay them anything in addition. By contrast, in Deuteronomy 15, an Israelite slave owner is required not only to release the debt of his slave, but also to provide them a generous parting gift so that they are not sent out empty-handed. A former Israelite slave, then, is not left in poverty upon rejoining the Israelite community, but rather is given a fresh start, both an opportunity and the means to reestablish themselves in society. Verse 15 cites the Exodus. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. For this reason I lay this command upon you today. This reference is important. For one thing, it tells Israelite slave owners to recall what happened to the Israelites when they were slaves in Egypt, to think about it, and to respond by treating their Israelite slaves humanely. More generally, though, it calls the entire community to remember, understand, and actually do a number of things. First, the Israelites were once slaves in Egypt, at which time they did not differ in wealth, privilege, status, etc. No one, therefore, should presume that their current situation, in which some have means and others do not, has always been so. Second, God redeemed the Israelites from slavery, which means that their social order, including the distribution of wealth, is not fixed but changeable, not static but dynamic. Third, the rich have received their bounty from God as a blessing. It is therefore a gift to be shared for the good of the community, not a possession to be used for one's own exclusive interests. Fourth, Israelites, especially slave owners, should act like God, not Pharaoh, in dealing with others. Fifth, the Israelite community should reflect the religious and social vision of the Exodus, in particular by eliminating excessive debt burdens that put people in a condition of permanent poverty and force some of them into slavery. Leviticus 25:39-46 is the last slave law. It probably dates from the end of the monarchy between the late 7th and early 6th centuries BC. These years were a time of national emergency. When Josiah was killed in battle against the Egyptians in 609, Israel lost its independence and became a vassal, first of Egypt in 609, then of Babylon in 603. Israel rebelled in 599, 595, and 588. In 587, the Babylonians crushed all opposition, destroyed Jerusalem, executed a number of religious, military, and government officials and prominent citizens, and deported another group of people to Babylon. Disillusionment set in because the reforms of Deuteronomy that Josiah had undertaken had not prevented the fall of the state and the first exile. Some, therefore, questioned whether God was faithful to God's covenant with Israel or had the power to control world affairs. As a result, the worship of foreign gods returned and public morality declined. Prophets such as Jeremiah and Ezekiel addressed these developments, especially the captivity in Babylon, by envisioning a different way for Israel to be faithful to God in a foreign land without the temple and its rights and priesthood. God would make a new covenant and write it in people's hearts. God would live not just in the temple in Jerusalem, but in the community itself, wherever it might be. Israel would respond to God not just through worship conducted by priests in the temple, but through each person's living out, in all of their activities and relationships, the new covenant written in their heart. Leviticus 25, 39 to 46 reflects a third actual situation in Israel during the late 600s to early 500s BC, or around 400 to 500 years later than the one in Exodus 21, and around 100 years later than the one in Deuteronomy 15. Slavery continues to be practiced. Israelites still own fellow Israelites, both men and women, as slaves. Verse 39 indicates that some Israelites are selling themselves to other Israelites as slaves. As in Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15, these Israelite slave owners are probably wealthy landholders. These Israelite slaves, however, are land tenants who are unable to pay debts they owe to their landlords. Unlike Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15, Leviticus 25 forbids an Israelite to own another Israelite, either man or woman, as a slave. Verse 39 allows poor Israelites to sell themselves to other Israelites. Verses 39 to 41, however, stipulate that such persons enter their purchasers' households as hired workers, not as slaves. They are paid wages which are applied to the principal balances of their indebtedness. Leviticus 25 thus abolishes the enslavement of Israelite men and women by Israelite slave owners. According to verse 40, Israelite debtors serve their Israelite creditors until the year of the Jubilee. In the Jubilee year, which came every 50 years, debts and debt service obligations to creditors were canceled, and debtors returned to their ancestral lands and families. So one way for a debtor to obtain freedom was to work for their creditor until the year of the Jubilee. Another was to satisfy the underlying debt through either the debtor's labor or payment in full by their relatives. Verse 40 thus provides that an Israelite's debt service ends when the next Jubilee occurs or their debt is paid, whichever comes first. Verse 41 presumes that a debtor would have sold their land before selling their labor to a creditor. When they are released from debt service, they return to their ancestral land, i.e., they receive back the land that they had sold previously. The debtor thus re-enters the Israelite community debt-free and with some means to escape from poverty. Leviticus, then, differs from Exodus and is similar to Deuteronomy in how it deals with what happens at the end of an Israelite's term of debt service. Unlike Exodus 21, which requires an Israelite slave owner to release the debt of his slave but not to give them anything more, and like Deuteronomy 15, which requires an Israelite slave owner both to release the debt of his slave and to make them a generous parting gift, Leviticus 25 gives the former debtor a chance to avoid going back into debt and having to sell themselves into debt service again. The motivation for this treatment of debtors is given in verse 42. It is the Exodus. For they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves are sold. The Israelites were once slaves in Egypt. God redeemed them, making them slaves to God and no one else. No Israelite, not even a poor one, can therefore sell themselves or be sold by anyone as a slave. In addition, Israelites must worship and serve God, not only in the temple and through temple rites, but also in their community and through the equity and justice of their social order, relationships, and interactions. A final point of comparison should be noted. Exodus 21 permits the slavery of an Israelite man or woman with limits and does not fundamentally improve their financial position when they return to freedom. Deuteronomy 15 also allows a male or female Israelite to be enslaved, but gives them the means to become financially independent and stay out of debt and slavery after being freed. Its objective, thus, is not to end slavery, but to make it more humane. Leviticus 25, by contrast, abolishes slavery altogether and provides post-debt service financial protections for the ex-debtor, similar to those of Deuteronomy 15. Let's summarize and compare the three scriptures as they pertain to the two questions about Israelite slavery that were posed at the outset. Exodus 21 dates from around 1200 to 1000 BC, Deuteronomy 15 from the 700s, and Leviticus 25 from the late 600s to the early 500s. In Exodus 21, the Israelites are settled in the land of Israel after the Exodus. In Deuteronomy 15, they are experiencing religious and social upheaval, internal domestic problems. In Leviticus 25, they are facing a national emergency, threats from abroad. Exodus 21 says that an Israelite can own a fellow Israelite as a slave, but only for 6 years in the case of a man, or while a member of the owner's household in the case of a woman. Deuteronomy 15 says that an Israelite can own a fellow Israelite as a slave, but only for 6 years in the case of both a man and a woman. Leviticus 25 says that an Israelite cannot own a fellow Israelite, either a man or a woman, as a slave. When an Israelite slave is released from slavery, Exodus 21 requires the owner to release their debt, but not to give or pay them anything else. Deuteronomy 15 requires the owner to release their debt and to give them a generous parting gift. Leviticus 25 requires the creditor, not owner, to release the debtors, not slaves, debt, and to return them to their ancestral land. In Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, and Leviticus 25, the rationale for the slave law is the Exodus. Exodus 21 allows the slavery of an Israelite with limits. Deuteronomy 15 allows the slavery of an Israelite with limits, but makes it more humane. Leviticus 25 abolishes the slavery of an Israelite. This summary and comparison show that the slavery of Israelite men and women was treated differently at three separate points across 4 to 5 centuries of time. What were the Israelites doing, and why and how were they doing it? In Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, and Leviticus 25, Israel was interpreting its covenant with God in the context of its changing historical circumstances, adapting its life together in view of its conclusions, and thus striving to fulfill the covenant and be faithful to God under all conditions and in every facet of its community. With regard to Israelite slaves in particular, the Israelites remembered, God redeemed us from slavery in Egypt. They reflected and came to understand that by delivering them from slavery in Egypt, God had been compassionate toward them. They asked, how should our fellow slaves, the poorest Israelites, the most marginal members of our community, be treated? How can we be compassionate toward them as God has been compassionate toward us? How can we redeem them as God has redeemed us? In Exodus, they answered, by placing limits on the slavery of Israelite men and women. In Deuteronomy, they answered, by placing limits on the slavery of Israelite men and women and making the conditions of their slavery more humane. In Leviticus, they answered, by making no Israelite a slave. The Israelites remembering, reflecting, understanding, asking, and answering about Israelite slavery went on for some 400 to 500 years. It yielded three different yet similar responses at three different points in time. These responses are different in that they set out different regulations for Israelite slavery. For example, on the question of whether an Israelite could own another Israelite as a slave, Exodus 15 said, yes, and male and female Israelite slaves may be treated differently. Deuteronomy 21 said, yes, but male and female Israelite slaves must be treated the same. Leviticus 25 said, no. On the other hand, these responses are similar in several ways. First, they resulted from the same process of remembering, reflecting, understanding, asking, and answering. Second, they were based on the same criteria: the Exodus, the mighty act of God in delivering the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, and the covenant, the Israelites' faithfulness to God who had redeemed them. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they reflect the same quest, a continuing endeavor on the part of the Israelites to remember the Exodus, to fulfill the covenant, and to be faithful to God in every generation, place, circumstance, and aspect of their life together as people of the Exodus, the covenant, and faith in God. In light of this study of the slave laws in Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, and Leviticus 25, you are now invited to consider some questions related to the nature, interpretation, and application of Scripture. I'm Greg Prymak. Thanks for watching.